I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Over the last year and a half, I had the privilege of working with a team of professional Access developers to bring a new version of the Northwind template to the Access community. And since the release of the template, the team has been able to give several presentations on Northwind, most of which are recorded and available, as Kim already mentioned earlier. Many of them are available on YouTube and other places. So if you want to go and see what other presentations have been given, you can find them by looking for Northwind. One of the things about this project was that we tried to incorporate a number of modern features, including a ribbon, multi-instance forms, and global error handling. So Tom and Kim have talked about many of the other factors, other features, including the inventory module and so on. Tonight, they're going to dive into error handling, including a look at the class which supports it for 2.0. So I'll turn the time over to them. I'll let them introduce themselves to our group and maybe talk a little bit about the background for this feature of Northwind Developer.
Tom, you can go first.
Tom, you want to go? You want to share?
So Tom and I and George Hepworth, George Young, and Dawn Taylor are the team that worked on Northwind 2 together. And I can confirm what George has said. It was truly an honor and a privilege to be part of this group. We worked well together. It doesn't mean we didn't have our contentious moments, but in the end, we always came together and did what was best for the product and what we were doing. I'd like to start off first, though, with a personal note. This project happened because of Tom. Tom, for years, had believed that the community, people in the Access community, could provide a improved Northwind 2. As professional developers, we all criticized what was wrong with Northwind, and he wanted to make it better. He spoke to numerous people at Microsoft over the years and got a lot of no's, and ultimately, he met Michael Aldridge, who said yes. And without Tom's persistence, this would not have happened. I mean, we all participated in it, but in the end, it was Tom's vision, and he was our leader. And it was a great experience. And all of us did this as a gesture to give something back to the Access community, because we've all had great careers building wonderful apps and having a lot of fun along the way. So one of the things I'm going to tell you is we want feedback from you. It's important. And part of what you're going to see today, and Tom will talk about exactly what is different. This isn't the original error handler that we deployed with Northwind 2. It's been improved, and it got improved based on a comment from someone in the community. So we are listening to it. We are looking at the feedback, and we're trying to put the improvements in where we can. So when I say we want your feedback, there's a few things I need to mention. We cannot use code written by anyone that was not a part of this team. So we can't publish links to articles that do not belong to Microsoft, because in the end, we publish through them. We couldn't use icons that weren't from Microsoft. Everything we wanted to deploy had to be contained within the database. So yes, we have images and pictures in the database because that was the only way we could give them to you. We cannot just publish an update whenever we want to. We need to go through the Access team and have them help us get this out. And we've all, over the years, complained about whatever Microsoft did that we didn't think was great. But what I can say is working with a large number of different groups at Microsoft was truly a pleasure. We were not ever in anyone's work list of what they were supposed to accomplish this year. We were a side hustle. We were an extra thing. People worked with us through their lunch hours, at night, on the weekends. They couldn't have been more helpful. And that was truly amazing. I mean, we worked with one of the biggest companies in the world. Tom got them to publish an application produced by 5 people who didn't work for them. And somehow it happened. So Tom deserves a great round of applause from all of us for his contribution to making this happen. During the rest of today's presentation, we may mention occasionally some third-party tools that we use or that you could look into. We are not compensated. We are not paid by them. We do it because we like the tools and we want to give you the information that we have. I have a teaser. One of the things we had to do to publish was work with the accessibility group at Microsoft. Microsoft takes accessibility very seriously, and we had to go through accessibility testing and make sure that the app would be screen reader, that you could have the right kind of contrast. And we're hoping that we're having a presentation for Maria Barnes's group the last Tuesday in September, and Linda Lucanen, who was our Northwind liaison for this part of the project, will be a part of that meeting and talk to you about accessibility. And I didn't even know you could do it for Northwind. And everyone on the team has said, from now on, I'm going to make sure every app I deploy follows these standards because it really matters. So with that being said, Tom's topic is the error handling, and it's about more than that. It's also about good debugging techniques. So Tom, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you for those kind words. Yeah, it was definitely a team effort where at least 24 people, contributed to the success of Northwind 2. It took 16 months to put together. And today we're just going to be talking about a small aspect of it, error handling. It's a topic that I've been interested in since I became a programmer. Actually, since my then wife, who was a programmer 3 years before me, looked at my first code that we were working on together and said, no, that's not how you do it. You don't expect that the user is going to play by the rules. You have to learn how to write code in a better way, and if something bad happens, you need to be able to handle that as well. So today we're going to look at a number of ways you can deal with errors inside of an Access application, and in Northwind 2 in particular. That will just be an example, but any Access application should have proper error handling. I'm sure we can argue a little in the margins about what proper error handling is, and I'm just going to show you what we came up with as a team. It was mostly contributed by me, but other people have had input as well as input from the community, as Kim already alluded to, that we will talk about in a moment. Today, we're talking about runtime errors. So runtime means the application is running and something bad is happening. It is not, for example, compile time errors. When you go debug compile and the compiler points out some errors in your code, we're not talking about that today. We're also not talking about errors that happen inside of msaccess.exe or inside of the operating system. Those are all outside of our purview. Even if we wanted to, we could probably not do very much about it. If Windows crashes, we'll crash with it. Or if Access crashes, we'll crash with it. But there are things that we can do and should do. And just as an initial introduction, let's look at what if we did nothing. And that's what this application does. Behind this button is some code that divides 1 by 0, just to get a quick error message. And there is no error handling whatsoever. So this is, and I'm running an ACCDE. So this is how you would deploy your application to your clients. And when they click the magic button, they get a message like this. The expression on click you entered as the event property setting produced the following error, division by 0, and some more detailed information. If you click that away, done here, we're back to the form. This is a second, slightly more complex issue where we have a button that calls another procedure, And in that procedure, we're dividing 1 by 0. And the error message is actually exactly the same. And difficult for a user to fully understand what's going on. This is not a standard message that one would expect. It's more like, it looks like a system message. That is our form 1. Let's leave it at that for a moment. And let's look at the code behind that I already alluded to. And before we actually look at the code, let's look at how I've set up my VBA environment. This is something you can do for yourself as well. There are a couple of elements that not everyone uses or maybe doesn't quite know how to use. So I just want to touch on that for a moment. Here on the right-hand side, we have a couple of docked windows, the watches and the locals. They're all available here from watch and locals. So locals would give me my local variables, local meaning scoped to the current procedure, right? If inside a procedure you declare a variable and give it a value, that variable would show up here with its value and its data type. So that's kind of convenient as you're stepping through code and stepping into functions that you can see the values. Another way to do the values is to type them out here in the immediate window. Most of you will know this. You can say question mark, whatever variable name you want to know about that is in scope, right? In the current procedure. And if it is in scope, you will get the value back. On the upper right-hand side is our watch window. So in addition to looking at locals and coming up with your own things that you're interested in, this could include a global variable, right? Or a module level variable, whereas locals is restricted to the current function, current procedure. Watches can be wider as well, because the context will tell it how far you want to see it. Just within this one procedure or within all procedures, just within this form or within all forms and all modules. And in my case, I want to look at the error object. So this is an object, a global object that is always around and always has some values, some default values that will change when an error occurs. So right now, the error.number is 0. We haven't gotten any error yet. I'll leave the properties window alone for now. But in other contexts, when you're designing forms, you will probably already know that if you're designing a form, that you have the property sheet here, of course, and you think maybe that these are all the properties that are available. Not so. There are some extra properties here in this kind of view. For example, related to themes. If you have a control that has themes on it, there are some additional properties that are available. For example, if I have a command button here, have you ever heard of the border theme color index? Well, now you have. And so these are additional properties that are sometimes available depending on your context. We won't be talking about this today. Frankly, I can probably close this. And in the center, of course, I have my code window. As we, so I had 2 buttons on the form, right? And those 2 buttons have these event procedures that I created. The first button is dividing x by 0, as I already said, and then a message box after division by 0. Did you see that message box? No, you didn't. This line of code never ran when we ran the demo. This is the second demo that consists of 2 procedures. One is the second event procedure, the second button, which calls some subroutine and then says back in the caller. We never saw this message. And so in this case, as I already pointed out, we're stepping into a subroutine we are then dividing by 0, we also never saw this message. So that is the normal way things work when you have no error handling whatsoever. Access essentially stops the entire processing, gives a message, and we're completely done. And it doesn't really matter whether the error happened in a subroutine or in a event procedure itself. You essentially get the same message, and access stops. It doesn't stop working, doesn't crash or anything like that. It doesn't close, but processing has stopped, and we're waiting for a new user input. Obviously, this is not what we want to do for our applications. We can also look at it one step better. One step better would be that we have a form and we drop a button on it while the wizard is on. So here we have a control wizard. If the wizard is on, I think it's here, right? Use control wizards. If that wizard is on and you grab a button and drop it on the surface, the wizard will come up and say, what do you want to do with this button? And so I just picked 3 different things just to see what Access would do. And let's run this and see what happens. So here's one. And we want to see what kind of error handling happens. You didn't specify search criteria with a find record action. In the macro window, insert a find record action before the find next action. Okay, show of hands, how many people understand this? And another show of hands for how many customers would understand this, end users. This is a useless error message in my book. So something bad happened. That's about all you can get from it. Good job, Terry. Oh, and then you get a second dialog that essentially says your macro failed. What do you want to do next? Do you want to step? Is disabled, continue, disabled? You can stop all macros. That's basically your only option. And you have a lot of gobbledygook that nobody, at least as an end user, would understand. This is really for programmers. But for example, there's no way here to step into the macro code and debug it, or go to the previous line and try again, or inspect variables, nothing of that kind. Here's another one. I picked a different path through the wizard. And I said, let's open a form. The name of the form is form 2, which we don't have. So this is the behavior that would happen. And again, you get a lot of text that people just wouldn't know what to do with. And the same behavior here. You know, programmers will perhaps realize what's going on here. These are the arguments to document open form. All you can do is say stop. Third one is a little bit different. We actually have a message. It's a message box. It doesn't have an icon. Not great. But at least you have something that says you can't copy right now. That's not too bad. This wizard path was about copying the current record to a new record. Well, we're not on a bound form here. We're not on a record. So it's normal that that fails. And this is a somewhat appropriate message. Of course, we still didn't get a lot of things. We didn't get any, for example, logging of messages. We didn't get any centralized error handling. And if you look at the code, it's really horrendous. Let's do that here real quick, just for fun. Start with a simple one. So we have to go to our events macro. So this one is very simple. Find next was all that there was. No error handling here, right? There is rudimentary error handling available for macros, but this wizard path had decided that that wasn't necessary. So you don't get the pretty message, you get something way too cryptic. This one is very similar. Document open form for form 2. Again, no error handling whatsoever. But this one is a little different. We do at least have some error handling. but not the greatest in the world. On error, go to next. So this is what I call the Ostrich approach. Stick your head in the sand and keep working. It means it's similar to, it is the same as on error, resume next. It basically means ignore this error and keep going. Do set the error number and the error description, populate the error object, but don't take any further action, just continue. And so the strategy that is used here is, let's ignore errors, but keep track of them. Let's do a select record. If the macro error is 0, then let's do our next step, run menu command. If the macro error equals 0, go to a new record, select that record and paste. That makes some sense, but no human would ever write this kind of code. This is testing, first saying ignore errors and then testing after each line. Say if no error occurred, then let's do the next line of our process. And then at the very end it says, so if we fell all the way through and we did have an error, we get a message box that said something bad happened, and that is the pretty message that you received. So we could certainly have added a little icon here. So that's not the worst thing. But this kind of macro code is not something that humans ever would write. And as VBA programmers, most people don't like macros too much anyway. But you can see that this is kind of the level of at its best. This is what the macro editor comes up with, and the button wizard. Now I could come in here and say, once we close this, there is an option when you're at the form level to say convert forms macros to Visual Basic. So you would say, well, maybe that's the way to go then. So let's look at that. Exact same form. I mean, you can even not see that I just opened it. But this time we have event procedures rather than macros. Let's take a look. That's our first button. So we do have an error handler. Do command find next. We have an exit label and we have the error label. This style of labels is very old. That is from, I think the last time was Access 2.0, where labels indeed had to be unique per module. So you couldn't just call them all exit label and error label. You had to give them individual names. Apparently that code was never updated. Then we have our find next action. And then here is our message box error string. So this is shorthand for error.description. So again, the converter didn't make the message box any better than it was before. But this is the level of code that you would get from the converter. Here's that second button. Here they decided that it was important to put the XML in so that you could see what we're actually converting. Really, it's just one statement, find next record. The rest is all XML fluff. And by the way, that is the wrong comment. I just discovered this yesterday and I had to work today, so I didn't investigate this, but this comment is inappropriate for this button. This is the open form second button. This comment belongs to the previous button that we already looked at, the one that said find next. So something fishy is going on here, I think. I didn't copy paste anything. This is just generated by the wizard. Here is the last one. So that was the one where we were testing for errors. This one is also a real beauty. First, we set up our error handler. That's okay. Then immediately we cancel it because we saw in the macros that it says on error, resume next. So we're going to do that here too. Then we're going to execute our first command, select the record, and then we're going to test if an error occurred. And if that did not happen, then let's execute the next statement. Well, macro error is not really functioning inside of VBA. I just confirmed that with Microsoft about a month ago, and they said, yeah, that was probably not the best choice. They should have said something like, if err.number equals 0, then continue. If err.number equals 0, then continue. Macro error is not the right thing to do. That was just a leftover from the macro days. And here we get a little beep. That's interesting. And then I've never been able to actually make this one generate an error, and I'd be interesting to see if this object gets populated. But suffice to say, this is really also not what we want. And then we have our global, not global. Then we have our outermost error handler that we essentially canceled because we did this. But that then results in some pretty poor code. So doing nothing or using the built-in control button wizards, control wizards, we should really never do that. So let's think about one step better. And that would be Northwind 1. But as you guys already have heard here today and also in previous presentation, we've said, why are we doing Northwind 2? For a number of reasons, and error handling was certainly one of them, certainly not the only one. So let's take a look at how Northwind 1 does error handling. We have a class module to handle errors, and it looks like this. It has a couple of methods, LogError being the principal one, which seems somewhat appropriate, although we never log anything. I've actually asked the question. You can probably hear that I'm not a native speaker. I'm from the Netherlands originally, and I actually asked the question to the community, what do you think when you hear LogError? And everyone says, we're writing it to a text file, we're writing it to a database table. None of that's happening here. The only logging that we're doing is we're doing a message box. We're showing the error message to the user. But at least we have one. We have one that's somewhat decent. We are composing an error message from the available information, such as error.description, error.number, right? We're also taking advantage of stuff that's being passed into us. I think I'll skip this for now, just looking at the clock. But this is fairly decent, and then we're showing the message. This is a bit unusual. Essentially, what this says is, if you have turned debugging on somewhere else, then we're going to return true. And then if you write your error handler correctly, we will do a resume for you. I'll get to that in a second. That's unusual, but. And then the other methods are try methods. Try to close an object, try to go to a record, run a command, or save a record. And these are very thin wrappers around VBA code. So I'm not exactly sure what the idea here is that whenever we want to close an object, we will call try, so that we will do it within an error handler. And if closing of that object fails, then at least we have an error handler. Now note, we're not calling LogError, which is one problem with this code. We should have called the function that we just so carefully wrote instead of doing our own message box. So that is the one criticism. One thing that's good about it is that now we're using standard labels, but not always. Here we have one that doesn't use any error handling. So again, this seems a bit haphazard. It also seems like if you want to write these try functions, and I could see that that is something that one would think about, why would you leave it at these 4? Are these the only 4 things we're going to do in the application? I don't think so. And what makes some of them worthy of a try function and others not? I don't really know. Maybe it was just a suggestion from that previous team. I don't know. The other interesting thing is, so if we look at LogError, it is indeed used in the application. By the way, Kim already mentioned that I would call out if we used an external tool. Well, this toolbar here, actually these 2 rows of toolbar, that is MZ tools, MZ tools, if you were German. It is one of those tools that for $80, I think everyone should have that in their toolbox. It's the one that I use the most. It has a many different features. One that I'm going to use here is do a find operation, and find then gives me a list of everything that happened so that I can just eyeball it and see where I want to jump. So as we look at this here for a moment, this is our, so where's LogError used, right, is my question. So of course it's in the error handling module itself. It is in another class that we haven't looked at yet, record set wrapper. Let's leave that alone for a moment. The main function wrapper, let's leave that alone for a moment. I could talk about this for an hour. And then I want to focus for a moment on the VBA documents where we have 3 reports. Let's ignore those for a moment. And so only 2 forms and only 1 procedure each has an error handler. We know that Northwind has at least 15, 20 forms. And each of these forms probably has between 5 and 20 event procedures. So we can surmise that error handling is sparsely used. Certainly not consistently. So I said that I would explain the little hokey code at the bottom of that LogError function. So LogError is going to return true or false. And if it returns true, if LogError is true, then we call resume. So if we're in a debug state, then we call resume, which is somewhat nice because that would make us jump back to a line of code above here where the error occurred. So you can continue to step, and because you're in the debugger is what the assumption is. And it will then resume at the line where the error occurred. So that's what they were doing there. But as you can see, there are many procedures that have no error handling whatsoever. And I just opened a random one. I'm not picking on anybody. There's nothing here. Here's another one. Try to run command, but no error handling otherwise. For example, if get list price was to fail or so, that's too bad. Because this product ID does not exist, whatever. So looking at my notes, is that what I want to talk about? Oh, yes. So that is Northwind. I want to talk about this EH. What is that? So Shift F2. So that is a public variable that instantiates a new error handling object. So that is okay. That's an okay way to do it. And especially if you do it here at the module level, this will just instantiate when the application starts. And so EH is always around. I would probably call it something else, but let's not nitpick. In Northwind 2, we're doing it differently, and I'll show that in a moment. So limitations that we see here are no error handling, mostly no error handling in the code. What error handling there is message box error description, no logging, no taking advantage of the line number where an error occurred. We haven't talked about that yet, but you can actually know on what line it occurred if you use line numbers. No line numbers are used here. This is another little toolbar button for MC tools where you can easily get line numbers or take them away. You can also find code in the public domain that does this at the global level. Of course, MZ tools can do that too. Add line numbers would do it for the whole project or for an individual object, right? So having line numbers, and we have them in Northwind 2. Some people have complained about it, but I think they are very important because they give you extra information, especially if it is a situation where someone is reporting an error to you and says something happened. Well, you can go to the log file. We will have a log file, and it will tell you that the error happened on line 30. That tells you something. All right, so let's close this. This is also really below the line. As we're looking at Northwind 2, what I did is this is actually not Northwind 2. I pulled out the parts that I needed for my demo. I have a demo module for how Northwind 2.0 is the version that you can download today and that was released in April. And then this is the demo code for Northwind 2.2 that's coming up, hopefully by the end of this month. And this is the error handler copy paste, not copy paste. I'll talk about that. This is the error handler as we use it in Northwind 2.0, and this is the one that's coming. Okay, so that's why the numbers are that way. So let's start with Northwind 2. And I have 2 tests again, similar to the buttons that the 2 buttons that you saw in the very first demo, where there was no error handling whatsoever. And we just did I believe I did a dim X, but debug.print is the same thing. Of a division by 0. And then in our second test down here, we call a subroutine. And in that subroutine, we do a division by 0. And we have a few extra message boxes to show us what's going on. So I first want to run it full speed, and then we'll step in. Before we do that, we're also going to add our watch for all procedures and all modules, so we can see our little arrow object here. So before I dive in here and start running code, I'd like to pause for a moment and see if there's any pressing issues that we want to address before we move forward. If so, Kim, maybe you can facilitate.
I haven't seen any questions in the chat window. George H., did you see any? I'll take that as a no from George.
All right.
I think not, Kim.
Okay, great.
Excellent. So I'm going to run these just the 2 button clicks. So this is not this is a fake, if you will. I'm simulating an event procedure. I don't actually have a form. I could, but I decided to do it this way. Let's pretend this is an event procedure. Whether it's a button click or a form open, it really doesn't matter, but it's an event procedure that's going to divide by 0. And this is the error handler as we have it in Northwind 2.0 that you can download today. And so let's run this and see what happens. Are we going to get the message box or not? F5. So we get an error message. The following error has occurred, division by 0 on line 20. In procedure, it doesn't fit on that line, so it moves to the next line. Mod demo 20 dot and the name of the procedure. The error number is here. So we have all the information that the error object can provide that is in any way useful to us. Please notify the help desk. Thank you. And before we step into the code, let's run the second example. So this is the one where we call a subroutine, which is then going to divide by 0. So if I hit F5 on this one, I'm going to get the exact same message, but it says in procedure sub 1. No surprise there, because that's where we did the division by 0. And we get a success message. So we call sub 1. it gives us an error message, and then blissfully unaware, we get a success message. So we'll talk about the consequences of that and how we can improve on that, because that is, we made an improvement in 2.2 to deal with it in a different way. But I want to start here and just this time, now you've seen what it does. I just want to add you to see the code actually in action. So we're dividing by 0, which makes us jump to the error handler. We're going to step into the error handler, passing in 2 arguments, kind of contextual information, if you will, F8, the module name and the procedure name. We are going to look at our error object and collecting information from it. So just like you see it populated here in our watch, and you can now also see that our local variables are being populated. For example, LNG error line is still sitting here at 0 until I do a step. Now it's sitting there at 20 because error is 20. Then in our error handler, again, this is the exact same one from Northwind 2.0. If we're dealing with error 2501, then we don't want it. We can talk about why not, but essentially, this is not an error. The open form action was cancelled. Typically, it means that the user doesn't have access in the form open event. We set cancel to true. It never happened. We don't really want to see an error message. If you feel otherwise, then comment this out or delete it. And here is an interesting function, LogError to file. So here we're filling in the promise of we don't just show it to you, but we actually are logging it even before you see it. Here's where you see it. We have already logged it to a file. So we just print the information that we have to a file. I'll show you the file in a moment. For now, I'm going to step over it. That's not our focus. And here we're composing the message. Again, if we have line numbers, then LNG error line will not be 0. So we add an extra line to our output. Please notify the help desk. Set that up. We already saw that. And after that, we're back in the procedure that caused the error. We resume at the exit handler. Why are we doing that? And why are we not just falling out of the bottom of the function? That is because typically, this is a best practice, I think. In the exit handler, you could do some cleanup. That, for example, maybe there's an object that was created here that needs to be set back to nothing, or needs to be, maybe a record set was opened that needs to be closed. Typically, some cleanup happens after the exit handler and before we actually exit the procedure. And since you only want to write that code once and not repeat it here in the error handler before you end sub, we jump to the exit handler. So in these samples, it's also simple. We don't have that kind of code. But I'll tell you that in a production application, there's often code here. And let's just do a little bit quicker here for our second example. So here we're talking about stepping into a subroutine. And before we continue to step, let me show you one other thing. Unfortunately, that window cannot dock, but this is an important window to know about and an important concept to talk about for a moment. Call stack. So call stack, for those who haven't seen this too often, it is showing you where you are right now and where you came from. In this case, you came from that event procedure where we were just at. And it called sub1, and that's where we are now. So those are 2 stack frames is the terminology. And each stack frame has its own set of local variables. Because you know this, you know that here in this calling function, we may have local variables, and when we come back to it, they're still there. kind of somewhat magical in the sense is that all of that goes on the stack and the values are preserved. And when we come back to it, it pops off the stack and we continue to work with that. And it seemed all normal that it works that way. Well, somebody had to program that, of course, but we take advantage of it. And the other cool thing that you can do here is not just look at the list, but you can actually step into it. So I can double click this item. And now we are here. And you can see where in that stack frame we came from. And if we had local variables here, we could actually inspect them. And we could see that x equals 5. And down here, x equals 6. And we can go back into Control L, go over here. And our variable x is sitting at 6. The debugger and memory management all works together here in making these stack frames work. And it will become important here in a moment. So now you have that concept a little bit, is that we have a procedure here that we were working in, and we're kind of unfinished here. We were sitting here, and we're just going to do some work over here, and we'll come right back to you in a moment. Shift the variable. Here we take the error. No surprise, we go to the error handler. And you have already seen this. This is the exact same code as before. So we're in sub1, we took an error, F8. So we're at the bottom of sub1. We're going to its exit handler. We are done with this procedure. And we're coming back to the caller in that first stack frame, Control L. The other one is gone now. And shift the fade. This is our success message. So the success message is not great, right? Because we took an error and nothing good can come from that. It would probably be better if this did not run. If we took a serious error here, that any code after that doesn't run. So in 2.2, we're going to make that happen. But let's look at some alternatives. Someone might raise their hand and say, I know of a way, make this a function, and let that function return success or failure. And then you could say, if success, do the success message, else don't. Go to the exit handler. That would work in this particular limited fashion, function scenario. But I would submit to you, you're abusing the function. That's not what functions are for. A function, by definition, is a block of code, a single block of code that has a specific purpose, and it returns a value related to that purpose. So if I have a square root function, it is going to return a square root of whatever I pass in, not a success or failure. You see the difference? So in some cases you could, but that is not a universally good strategy. Something else I wanted to say there. Functions. So this is the Northwind 2.0 experience. And so we have this situation where this is not great. Let's look at 2.2. And let me tell you, Kim already alluded to it, is how come there's even a Northwind 2.2? Weren't we done in April? And we always knew that there's probably going to be feedback from the community. And there was, and in several ways. And we have made more than one change. But this one was really great. Joseph Pertzel, I hope I don't bastardize his name, from Austria, sent me a message and said, I've been looking in detail at Northwind 2.0, and there's a lot that I like. And I see that you did the error handling the way most people do. You're in some procedure, you report the error, and you exit, and the parent stack frame never knows what happens. And it's kind of become second nature. I have to say that I've written code like that for years. And he said there's a better way. And so I studied that and came up with a new demo. This demo looks 99% the same as before. The only differences other than, of course, we have a different module number. There's an extra argument here in our error handler. True, true, and nothing. That will become important in a moment. And yeah, let's do the same thing that we did a minute ago. Let's just first run it and then step in detail. So F5 runs the code. The following error has occurred in event procedure 1, error 11, call stack. There's a new entry here, call stack, that wasn't there before. So this basically says that one stack frame, that's where the error occurred. Please notify the help desk. Otherwise, no difference. The success message doesn't happen, just like in the previous example. But in our previous example, here the success message did happen because sub1 basically ate the error message and the parent stack frame never knew about it. Let's run it again, F5. I think you know where this is going. So there's now a call stack, a little bit more elaborate than the one we just saw. So it says that this event procedure called that sub1. So we know that we were in this stack frame and then we were in that stack frame. So it's kind of neat to know that as a developer, is that how did we get to sub1? Maybe it's a universal function that's called from all over the place. Well, this time it was called from over here. Or how is the path, you know, if you had multiple stack frames going on, function procedures calling other procedures, etc. But in this case, this didn't run. So we did not get a success message. So we want to know why not. So it is better in general, but how did that get done? So let's step into this procedure using F8. All the same, stepping into sub1 and into the error handler. And in the error handler, we now have our third argument, which is false by default. And the argument name is event procedure. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. For now, we'll just continue to step. This is the exact same code. And here it becomes different again. We are, for the first time, interested in error.source. It was always sitting here, but we were never really paying attention to it. The source by default is set to the name of the VBA project, NW2-demo. And I have a, you can read this using code. I chickened out and just made a little constant. So we are collecting what the source is, Shift F8. And if it is that constant, then let's just blank it out. So now our error source is an empty string. You saw it here. Shift F8. And we're now populating it with where we came from. What is our module name and procedure name that was passed in? So no surprise, that's our module name and that's our subroutine. Again, we're saying 2501 is nothing, log the error. This is also new. If not is event procedure, then Err.Raise. So we're saying if you are not in an event procedure, if the value true was not passed in as the third argument, then raise an error here. And what that does is it jumps us out of this stack frame into the previous stack frame. So we're now in handle error. We will jump out of that. And we're passing along our error number 11 and the error source that we've collected so far. More is to be done here. So, and we are not displaying the message that we were doing before. Sub1 was displaying the message. Now We take a shortcut, say, no, we're not doing it. And not just, jumping over this, but actually raising an error and going back to the previous stack frame, looking up the stack and saying, who has an error handler for me that I can use and continue there. So if I step now, that is exactly what happens, is that we were inside of this and we're now back in the caller where we came from. Oops, sorry. I meant Control L. You see? So we were in the error handler for sub1, and the Err.Raise says, cancel that, go to the previous stack frame, which is our event procedure. And it then gets a crack at that error. The error is still there. It was number 11 with this description and with this source. Look at that. The source is set to that. All of that is still available, and we continue to step. So now the parent gets a crack at the error message, and in this case, true is being passed in. F8. We collect our information. Is the error source equal to that NW2 demo? No, it isn't. It's some nice string here. Then let's continue to add to that a little arrow sign and Shift F8, the new module name where we came from. So this is how we build a stack frame. We came from here and then from there. 2501 is ignored, log the error. This time we step over this because it is in fact an event procedure. And we compose our message as before and show it to you. And we're back in our event procedure. We never call our message box, and we are done. So I think that is really cool. We have the ability with this to control if we want to display the error because we are in the top level stack frame, or if we want to postpone it and kick it up the chain of command if we are in a lower level, in a sub or a subset.
So Tom, we're at the hour.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think you were at the wrap up.
Yeah, I'm 3 to 5 minutes away. Okay. I want to touch on one thing, which is what is the deal with that event procedure? What is so special about event procedures versus all kinds of other procedures? And think about it this way. What makes code run? It is really the user interacting with the application. The application starts, okay, that's a little bit different, a little asterisk there. But for the most part, when we have a form is being opened by our startup code, let's say, form open event occurs, etc. The whole cascade of events happen. The user clicks on a button, the button click event happens. That is what makes code run. Sub1 will never magically run on itself, or the user couldn't do anything interactively with the application to just run sub1. It is only run as a side effect of running an event procedure. So event procedures are essentially these top level functions that are the first stack frame, and everything else that's not a event procedure is a sub level that is then subject to calling the error message up the stack frame. There are a few exceptions that I want to touch on. Number one is the AutoExec Macro calls, in the case of Northwind, it calls a public function called startup. And so startup is also a top level function. It was called by the AutoExec Macro, but it is a top level function. So if I was to write the error handler, I would put true in there, even though technically it's not really an event procedure, but it is a top level procedure. So that's one. And the second one is people might say, well, I have several buttons on my screen, and one of them is to close the application. Another button does some work and then closes the application. And so what I want to do after I do some work is I'm just going to call that button 2 click event, so that it does whatever it does to close the application. I say, although that's technically correct and acceptable, that is probably not the most elegant way to write code. You should really refactor the part that is about the closing and call that, and that would be a new procedure, and call that from 2 places, from both of your buttons. That way you could make your error handler continue to do exactly what I just described. If you were in a pinch and say, well, that's just not possible, I'm taking over a 100,000 line code project, we're not going to refactor all of that for a little gain, I would say leave it at false. You get the Northwind 2.0 behavior in these rare cases where event procedures call other event procedures. That's not that bad. The rest of the code, as you continue to develop it, will still take advantage of it. So that's that part. One final part is, for Northwind 2, we have a fair amount of code, and so we had a fair amount of work to do to put in these error handling code, and then also put in the new error handling code if it was an event procedure with this little true. I wrote code to do that. I've had that code for a long time. We're not sharing that. It's part of PredeclaredID's code base, the company that I work for in Phoenix. But essentially what it can do is it can take out an existing error handler and it can put back in a new one. And so with a bit of effort, we were able to essentially take out the 2.0 error handler and put in the 2.2 error handler, using true in places where it was needed and leaving it out in places where it was not.
Tom, doesn't MZ Tools provide a way to insert an error handler that you form, and then you would have to make the call on passing in the procedure that you wanted?
Yep, it does. It has put me on the spot somewhere here.
It's under
the
team options under error handlers.
Error handlers.
Yeah.
Sample. So MZ Tools has a way to use their little. This is not our error handler. You see a message box here. But using essentially their little coding, you can compose your own, and then you can do that on a one-person basis or a one procedure basis and insert the error handler. That's really great. If you wanted to do it across the board, I believe you still need to use some code. That code is available. The basic code is under Tools References. I set an extra reference to Visual Basic for Applications Extensibility. That gives me the VB IDE, which gives me, among many other things, the code module class, which has properties and methods such as insert lines. So you can insert a on error go to and so on. You can find out whether the current line is a body line, how many lines there are, what kind of procedure this is. Is it a function or a property, or there's all kinds of constants that go with that. Is the property get? So using this kind of code, you can write the code that I was referring to that can take out such error handlers and put auto style back in. I would certainly set aside a few weekends if you truly wanted to do a kick-ass job with that, by the way. It doesn't come super easy. That is Northwind 2 error handling. So let's open it up for questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Tom. Yeah, there are a few questions. Kim, I'm looking back up the list here. There was a long discussion about the origin of the ERL,
Oh,
how that is obtained and where it comes from, what it means. Do you have any?
the origin, I have no idea. I think it comes from earlier versions of BASIC, if I had to speculate, and it is a short for error line number. And it is one of those, Visual Basic is a messy language. It has all kinds of things that, for example, VB.NET had a really hard time with and sometimes had to leave behind because it's so super messy. It was by the seat of your pants. And this is one of those. It's a free floating global constant that gets a value every time you step.
I believe the only thing I was ever able to find out about it is if the number is there, it's considered a label. And so it looks for the label on that line, but it is truly an undocumented feature of Access. We're all aware of those, right? It's something that you can do, but you can't find any documentation about it at all. And why it recognizes that that is a line and a label, I think, is because it begins with a numeric value, but those are guesses on my part. Earlier in my career, I tried to hunt down this, and this was the best piece of little trivia I came up with along the way and have remembered it ever since. I use VB Watchdog. I know many people do. It's right under $300 US. Greatest error handler you could ever have. I personally will never write an error handler again. I only have to now be concerned with errors that I know are going to occur that I want to trap and then resume or do different things with. But it provides a way to toggle the line numbers on and off in a side window. It doesn't actually put them in the code. So somehow either VB Watchdog is doing that or something else is happening. I don't get any compensation for saying that. It's done by Wayne, who's putting Twin Basic together. It's one of his products. I'll never be able to write an error handler that good, so I'm not even going to try.
Yeah, he's a serious code wizard.
Yep.
Can I just interject here? I've just found on Luke's FMS Inc. Site, there's apparently ERL is a function. It doesn't tell you too much about it, but it does say that it will error unless you have lines, unless your code is numbered.
When
it will raise an error if it's
when I hit F1, I get the error object, and ERL is not even mentioned here. Oh, by the way, this doesn't work anymore. In preparation for this meeting, I thought, hey, how about that? Did you see those two help file thingies? Help file, that is a string, and the help context is a number. So I actually ran this exact example, and it doesn't work anymore. Help file information has been removed from the message box. There's no way for you to have that extra little help button that there used to be if you go back a ways like I do. So yeah, things do change over time.
Okay. So Adrian, you had another question. I'm scouting here for your queue.
Yeah, I'm afraid I put a couple in, George.
Okay. Here it is. When passing errors back up the call stack, how do you avoid multiple error message showing up?
Our message is showing.
So when passing it up the chain, the first error handler will take it. So you could have, in a situation where you were a bit more sloppy about putting in error handlers, and maybe your sub 1 didn't have one, but your subset 1 did. If we are in subset 1 taking an error, the Err.Raise that we looked at, it will first go to the next stack frame up and see that there is no error handler. It will go to the next stack frame. So whatever the first one is that has an error handler, that's the one that gets to run it then. And
so when you hit that raise error, that's before you actually do the message. So it won't actually do the message unless it's at the top level.
That's right.
Right, I'm with you.
Because
And
as
notice-
long as it's not the top level, because
and
as
notice-
long as it's not the top level, we continue to Err.Raise. So I didn't put that example together for you this time, but if you went 5 levels deep and you would pop all the way back up before you would go past this point to actually show the message.
Oh, and you're presumably, that is one of my other questions, or my last question was also about Err.Source. Now, presumably in this code that you've got here, every time it goes up a level, if it finds an error handler, it adds to the .source bit.
Absolutely. Yes.
Oh, I like it, Tom.
Isn't that nice? I mean, and then this is Joseph Purcell's work. When I first saw that, because in my commercial work, I do this a little bit differently. I do already know what stack frame we are in, because we do what we call pushing and popping of so our error handling code is a little bit more elaborate, and in addition to on error, we also push the name of the procedure on a stack. And so if an error occurs, we already know whether we're in the first stack frame or the second stack. But that's kind of besides the point. And once you have that, creating this kind of code is easy. But I never really realized until he showed it that you can find out what the stack frames are by doing this clever work.
Yeah, Err.Source. Yeah.
Okay, great. So there's another question here. John Colby wants to know, can we use the library you just discussed to automatically get the module and function names instead of the dev having to insert that?
No, there is no way that I know of in VBA to do that. That's unfortunate. If I was the dictator at Microsoft, that's what I would want.
I want to say, I think MZ Tools does that.
Yes, exactly.
If you use it
does that at design time, not at runtime. It inserts
the
name of the procedure by at design time looking at this string.
You're right.
Which is clever enough. I mean, you try to write a VBA parser someday. That is not the same thing as detecting at runtime what procedure you are in. That, I believe, is not available to us.
Yeah.
So one thing that I used to do in olden days before a lot of these tools came around is if you exported the module out as a text file, you could then loop through the text file looking for the pieces that you wanted, and then you filled them in where you needed to and push the code out. And sometimes that can be easier than knowing the intricacies of the VB IDE and what you need to do to make that happen. So once you've done it, you can then use it over and over again in other projects. Obviously, tools have advanced so that you don't have to do that, but that can be another alternative.
Kim, I just realized there's one more thing that I wanted to talk about. I want to contrast for 1 minute the difference between in Northwind 1, where we had that global variable EH as new CLS error handler, right?
Yes.
We don't do that here. We specify the name of the class itself. And what that means is what we have done is we have created this class as a static class. There's an important note here for those of you who say, hey, I want to use this code. Where can I find it? This is a static class. So this class is always there. The user doesn't need to instantiate it. There's no line of code here that says CLS error handler 22 equals new. That wouldn't even work because this is a static class. It exists just like the application object exists. And to use it in your own project, you have to use this procedure. Export the file out of this database and import it into your database. A simple copy paste is not enough. So don't come tell me that it didn't work. And the reason for that is, this is when I did an export. What you think is the first line of a code module is not, of a class module. This is the part above it. And this particular one here says that it is a static module, a static class. So that's why you have to do that. You cannot paste this in, that won't work, doesn't compile. You have to do the import export. So you go here and you say import file.
Mike Wolf also provides a script that you can include and then cause it to set the pre-declared ID for the classes that you want without having to do the import and the export.
Oh, that's awesome.
Awesome. Great.
I'll see if I can find that link.
Okay.
May I suggest that at some point you also look at logging errors to a table? We're database analysts, and
Right.
writing stuff out to a file. How do you
Right.
analyze your
I agree.
database errors?
I agree. And even for Northwind, we're not doing that. That, you know, it's a trade-off. That was just one little bridge too far. That when we try to keep it as a project within 12 months, it became 16. There's always more you can do. And this one didn't make the cut. So this is what we do. This is one line of, or one event of export. And it is indeed not great. You're quite right. And in my commercial projects, that's exactly what we do. We actually do both until we have a connection to the backend. We write to the log, to the text file. As soon as we have a connection to the backend, then we can write to the table. So in the very early stages where you're still coming up and haven't connected to the backend yet, if an error occurs, you can't write it to the backend. So you have to write it to the text file. In another situation, we're writing to the event viewer, the Windows event viewer. So there's all kinds of fancy stuff you could do. But point well taken. It should go in the table.
So while John has your attention, I will do a quick preview. John is going to be our presenter next month. And he's going to talk about event-driven programming using classes, which can expand the power of Access applications. So he's going to move on from where we are to, I guess, another installment of using classes. So, John, would you like to offer any previews of what you're going to talk about?
Yeah.
So then I put you on the spot. Then I put you on the spot.
No, I was just trying to figure out how to get unmuted. I don't, I'm kind of new to this Zoom thingy. So yes. I have worked with classes and event syncing and event raising in those classes since the late 90s. I was actually taught all this stuff by Shamil Selekednov. I have to apologize to him if I'm butchering his name, but a Russian fella, very, very nice guy. And this was back in the 90s when it didn't work very well. It caused Access to crash and stuff. Well, they eventually fixed it, and I've been using it ever since. So yeah, so I'm going to be discussing classes, syncing events in your own classes, and raising events in your own classes, and using classes to wrap controls to allow you to kind of sort of emulate inheritance. It's not inheritance, but it allows us to wrap a combo box or a form or anything that can raise events and then add your own handling inside of your own class for whatever that object might be. So that's going to be my discussion next month.
So I just went through this with John. It was super fun. I learned a lot. And I wish I would have known about it sooner.
So
So
will
I did
support that.
I did paste in the chat window for everybody the link to Mike Wolf's article on setting the pre-declared ID in VBA rather than having to export it out and import it back in.
Okay, perfect. I will make sure that all the links that are in the chat, anything in the chat goes into the discussion or the comments when it gets posted to YouTube.